many of these could apply to a romantic relationship as well, but I'm really going to look at the organizational factors, how malignant narcissists tend to behave in like medium-sized or large companies, or potentially even small companies. Now, I've consulted to a lot of companies in terms of like team building and helping companies adopt management structures that make sense. And I've seen malignant narcissists many times over the course of many years. And I've seen certain characteristics that just keep coming up over and over. And again, here are a few of them. So I've seen that malignant narcissists tend to attack people, again, in organizations, with criticism. And they feel a sense of relief when they criticize other people. A lot of times when they attack people with criticisms, they do so in a way where they kind of get the last word. So they'll mention a criticism like over the phone and then hang up, or say they have to go really quickly. So they want the person to kind of sit with that criticism but not have a chance to respond. Or they might say it kind of like passing in a hallway. You know, in a position where two people are walking different directions and they know you really can't stop and take the time to address it, and they'll hit you with that criticism and then kind of walk away. So really the criticisms are timed for effect. And even though they can be kind of sporadic and the timing is more or less carefully planned on the part of the malignant narcissist, they are stacked on one another. So it's usually a consistent chain of criticism. So there's a theme to it. I'll talk about this theme more when I get to the gaslighting component of malignant narcissism. So the next area I see here is that the malignant narcissist is very involved. With low levels of narcissism, we see people that often really just ignore other people. And that behavior gets interpreted as being arrogant or condescending or somebody really feeling special or unique or something like that. But generally, somebody with a low level of narcissism isn't highly involved with other people. They're not really actively trying to harm somebody. It might be a byproduct of their behavior, but they don't really seem to have a mission to hurt people, but rather a mission to protect a fragile sense of self. But with malignant narcissism, I see it more as an active attempt. Like really they're looking for trouble. They want to break people down. And there's certain triggers that occur for the malignant narcissist that really activate these behaviors. Like if you attempt to offer criticism to a malignant narcissist, they're going to attack. Now, if you do that to somebody with a kind of adaptive level of narcissism, or even one that's not at a healthy level, but not as high as malignant narcissism, they may not respond well to that. They won't necessarily attack. A malignant narcissist would tend to. And really, with malignant narcissism, I found there's no effective way to deliver feedback. So there's not even like a good time to offer a criticism. They're always highly reactive to criticism. Now, more worrisome, in my opinion, in terms of what it does to organizations, is really the next trigger, which is they're triggered when people that work for them display confidence, or even people that don't work for them. We see both depending on the situation. So if confidence is building, if somebody feels good about their abilities, that's a time when a malignant narcissist will attack with criticism. If somebody's demonstrating pride about an achievement, the malignant narcissist will belittle them. They'll belittle the achievement as well. And as I mentioned, this is one of the more worrisome signs. I don't like this in work settings. I think this is destructive to companies. But I also don't like it when I see it in romantic situations and in other social situations. When somebody's attacking somebody else's confidence or legitimate pride and achievement, that's really, to me, taking narcissism to a highly destructive level. It's kind of pervasive in addition to being pernicious at that point. Now, I mentioned before how when we look at kind of regular narcissism or slightly elevated narcissism, there's this idea that the individual is trying to protect a fragile sense of self, and that hurting other people is kind of a byproduct of that activity. So there's a lack of insight, they're unaware, they're acting recklessly, they're not considerate of other people, but there's an argument in terms of how intentional the behavior is. Intentionality is on a continuum, so there's always going to be some level of intentionality. It's sometimes difficult to figure out how intentional the behaviors are. With malignant narcissism, I have kind of a different view of the intentionality. I view the act of hurting other people with malignant narcissism as intentional, not simply a byproduct of trying to protect that fragile sense of self, but rather something that somebody does on purpose because of the sadistic component. So they're getting something from hurting somebody, and they know that's what they're doing. So, in a sense, they're aware of it, and they like being perceived as scary. So again, this is highly consistent with the idea of egosyntonic aggression and egosyntonic sadism. So somebody's being aggressive, again, criticizing or hurting other people in other ways, and that is okay with them. That is consistent with their values and beliefs. It's consistent with their thoughts and their feelings. So I view it as, again, more toward intentionality on the continuum. So the hurting other people part is more an intentional behavior as opposed to, again, lower levels of narcissism. So I guess another way of putting this is the malignant narcissist wants to hurt somebody for the sake of hurting somebody. And the lower level narcissist hurts people because they're trying to help themselves, hurts other people because they're trying to protect themselves. So yes, both types of narcissists hurt people, and we need to deal with that in terms of treatment and at a societal level. But for the malignant narcissist, hurting people is really an important part of the mission. So the next item here is gaslighting. And gaslighting we see with really all levels of narcissism, but the type of gaslighting I see with malignant narcissism is a little bit different. It's really planned over the long run. So the way I kind of see this gaslighting component with malignant narcissism is it kind of starts with really a delusional belief on the part of the malignant narcissist. It's a criticism, and it's a criticism they may believe, that would make it kind of delusional, or it's a criticism that they're putting in place but they know it's not true, and that's really kind of self-deception or just plain lying. They're just lying to everybody. So they start with this delusional belief, this criticism of another person, and they maintain it and build on it. I mentioned this before. So the attacks are really not random, they're rather thematic. So there's a pattern to them. So they'll start with some defect in another person, some defect they think is there, or again, they're going to say is there when it's not there. And they're going to take that defect and look at all the possible ways to express that that person has the defect, all the criticisms consistent with pointing that out. And they're going to really just come back to that over and over in different ways. They're going to hit that defect, whether it's real or not, from a number of different angles over a long period of time, which does really a more effective job in convincing somebody that they're actually the problem. So the person who has the gaslighting behavior directed toward them, they believe that they're the problem. That's what gaslighting is, when somebody tries to convince you you're the problem when you're not. But because it's planned over the long run, and because it sticks to a pattern, again, it's much more effective. So the malignant narcissist does a better job at convincing people that they're the problem, that the other person is the problem, and that there's nothing wrong with the malignant narcissist. And sometimes they actually frame it to where they're doing you a favor by pointing out how many defects you have. So again, smarter, I guess is the word that comes to mind, a little more clever in the way they plan out the gaslighting. Now, another characteristic of the malignant narcissist is they can behave when necessary, right? And this is mostly the case. So what I mean by this is, like say in an organization, there's people at different ranks, right, different levels of status in the organization. The malignant narcissist kind of knows that when they go to their supervisors, they need to be careful about how narcissistic they appear. But when they're dealing with their subordinates, of course, they're going to be narcissistic and abusive. So they can kind of turn the behavior on and off. And this goes back to what I mentioned before about intentionality. If it was really about protecting a fragile sense of self, they would be narcissistic with everybody, right? But we don't see that. We see that they know how to turn it on and off as needed. Now, again, I mentioned they can't always do this, and sometimes this is really their undoing in organizations, right? If they go after one of their supervisors in a narcissistic manner, that might lead to them not working there anymore. But still, most of the time I've seen they can control this, and this really speaks to how deliberate the behavior is. Now, when speaking about the idea of being deliberate, this moves me to the next point, which is the malignant narcissist can hide behind fake compassion. And this goes back to the superficial charm, which I mentioned I think is sometimes present with malignant narcissism, but it's not always there. They can appear to be compassionate for a short period of time and kind of convince people that they have genuine feelings. I've even seen malignant narcissists kind of cry on demand. But remember, it is still shallow, so they can't necessarily maintain that behavior for a long period of time, and there's no depth to it. It's not real in terms of they're not really having that feeling of compassion. But what this particular ability does is it allows them to move up in organizations, right? So they have a lust for power. That's what they really want, but it's disguised as passion, right? So you see this oftentimes with leaders in organizations. They'll say, oh, you have to excuse, my behavior, but I'm just passionate about the topic. But how I interpret that, at least some of the times, is they have a lust for power, and they're trying to convince you it's about some sort of passion. They're trying to convince you that they have compassion for people, and that's why they have to be disruptive and rude and arrogant and condescending. So they're really making an excuse, but it's an excuse that a lot of people buy. People are drawn to people that appear to be compassionate for others. But that really, I think, only matters. Like, I think compassion only matters, of course, when it's real. So we have to be careful about discerning real compassion from fake compassion. The last characteristic I'll talk about here in terms of the malignant narcissist is really about impulsivity. Now, one of the things about malignant narcissism is there's still an impulsive component. And the reason I think this impulsive component is maintained is because in order for somebody to be scary, at least to the maximum level, there has to be a degree of unpredictability. There has to be this idea, for the narcissist anyway, that people are going to walk on eggshells around them. And they have to keep this impulsivity always in their back pocket, ready to use it to keep that level of scariness there, right? So that's really why I think the impulsivity kind of stays around. Otherwise, I think the malignant narcissist would abandon impulsive behavior in favor of a more Machiavellianistic approach. But again, if somebody's impulsive, they can kind of dominate people around them more effectively through really terrorizing them, just frightening them into compliance. And of course that also builds with the kind of criticisms and all that. If someone who is impulsive is criticizing you, sometimes you're more inclined just to accept that criticism because you don't want them to impulsively act. So a lot of components here when we talk about malignant narcissism, and really all of them quite destructive. So the last question here is, what if you work with or for a malignant narcissist? What can you do? Well, unfortunately, I don't think there are a tremendous number of options. Therapy is fairly unlikely as an occurrence for somebody who has malignant narcissism because they're really having all their needs met. They have power, and they're exercising that power in a cruel way over other people. So there's really no reason for them to change from their way of thinking. Again, egocentric behavior here. Now, I think in terms of what you can do, if possible, get away from the malignant narcissist. I know that's not realistic in probably most cases. Try not to react. Try not to reinforce the behavior. When you react to the false criticisms, really the delusional criticisms, you reinforce it. The reaction is something the malignant narcissist wants you to do. So to the extent it can be avoided, I would say that would be generally a good idea, at least some circumstances. And kind of the last piece of advice would be, if necessary, just lay low. The nature of the malignant narcissist, the characteristics, will propel them to attack. And sometimes all you can do is hope it's not you, which seems like kind of a weird situation to be in, but I've seen this manifest in a lot of different ways in organizations. You see this kind of strange occurrence that can happen where somebody's kind of learned to lay low, and for that reason the malignant narcissist doesn't attack them, and they attack other people. And they explain, to me anyway, what I've heard is they say they have a kind of survivor's remorse. Like they've learned to avoid being attacked by the malignant narcissist, but they also know that means other people are going to be attacked, and they feel guilty about that. And really, I do view it as kind of a form of survival. They're just trying to survive. They're just trying to avoid being the one who gets victimized by the malignant narcissist. So I don't think they really necessarily have anything to feel guilty about, but I understand they do feel guilty. It's a natural reaction. And really, like I said, it's a lot like survivor's remorse. So those are some of the characteristics of malignant narcissism, and I explained kind of the way I understand the construct. So to kind of sum it up, I would say malignant narcissism is a combination of traits that allow somebody to succeed and get into a position of power while simultaneously driving them to harm people. So really, it provides no incentive for change. It's a bad combination of traits because of what it allows people to do in terms of harm.